In a certain hell, no one acknowledges the other's differences and consistently harbor hatred towards one another. Philosopher and adventurer Jaina Elliott. A battle between two forces separated by race and skill. Throughout the years, neither party has ever recognized the similarities that runs within each of their races. Hatred consumes each and every being on a planet that was no better than hell. The Knight Commander of the Crimson Army thrived in such an environment. This battle was decided the moment he captured the commander of the humans' army. All that was left was for him to savor the victory. The crucified commander was ordered to look out among his soldiers, who would soon be ripped apart, and to listen to the final screams of his pathetic kind. He wanted his captive to feel in his bones the greatness of the one who would become legend. He ordered his Crimson Army to march, to cut down every human who stood in their way, and to let the world know who the superior species were. By his command, the blood began to flow. The battle was simply one-sided, leaving behind the ultimate feast for the scavengers. The Knight Commander couldn't recall the last time he found joy in this world. Perhaps this was because his peers had long been wiped away. The battlefield simply didn't bring the same type of joy it once had. The human foolishly believed these people were nothing more than devils. But if they were devils, what did that make him? After all, this world was the embodiment of hell. On the outskirts of a remote castle, two servants chased down an escapee. Lito had no intent of ever returning to the place where he was enslaved. With his fork in hand, he put everything he had in his attempt to escape. Surely the boy understood that their lives were on the line. As a slave, nothing more than punishment awaited him. But in their case, failure meant they would lose their heads. Their constant banter was starting to drive him crazy. How did they expect to catch him when they did nothing but scream in his direction? The idiots deserved whatever they got. And at that precise moment, fate assured his demise. A single mistake was all it took for this hellish planet to consume him. His screams could be heard echoing as he fell deeper and deeper into the abyss. They couldn't believe the foolish human, running headlong in a place that was littered with such caverns. The two green-skinned servants were left with a new dilemma. Either follow the human into the abyss, or return to the castle which would surely lead to their death. With such a choice, there was only one way forward. Neither was thrilled by such a plan, but someone had to take the first step. The reluctant servant, looking for a way out of this mess, spotted the trace materials of what could only mean death to anyone who entered. The human was as good as dead. There was no need for them to follow in his footsteps. It was truly beyond belief, but Lito managed to survive his fall into the abyss. He slowly pulled himself to his feet. The unending darkness wouldn't stop him. He hadn't gone through all those trials to die in a place like this. But aimlessly fumbling in the darkness only led to him walking into the fine threads of an apex predator. He struggled to remove the gossamer, but this time his demise was assured. For in the darkness, a six-eyed beast was ready and waiting. Back under the stars, the two servants were lost in an unusual predicament. If their deaths were assured either way, climbing down and retrieving the body was their only chance at survival. But there was no chance in hell a certain servant was going anywhere near that death trap. The steady stride of a new arrival pulled their attention away from the impossible task. Before they had a chance for a full thought to pass through their brain, the servant who treasured his life had his head removed. The Knight Commander simply didn't have a need for more than one witness. The little green servant lost every ounce of reluctance when it came to dealing with the blue-skinned knight. Without being prompted, the servant began to spill his guts. Before his friend was decapitated, they were attempting to retrieve an escaped slave of the royal family. But they ran into a situation, for the territory below them belonged to that of the wicked winged spider. At the mention of the spider, there was no doubt in the mind of the knight whether the slave was still breathing. It was just a slave, so the royal family wouldn't have a problem replacing it. The servant, covered in sweat, explained that the situation wasn't that simple. The particular slave in question was wanted by the prince of the kingdom for stabbing him in the eye with a fork before he attempted to escape into the wilderness. The Knight Commander, who didn't find much joy in this world, broke out in a smile. As the servant explained, the enraged royal demanded the return of the slave alive. For the first time in a long time, he burst out in hysterical laughter. The moment the servant cautiously joined in, the commander lost all joy from hearing the news. To be stabbed in the eye by a slave, how could such a weak, pathetic child become their king? The knight commander moved on to more important topics, inquiring if the other knights had arrived at the castle. But the servant wasn't aware that the king had put out an emergency summons, of the Order of Knights, to this remote location. Such news hadn't reached the ears of such a lowly servant. The knight commander pondered why the king would have any interest in such a backwoods dump. The little green servant humbly dismissed himself. If the news was true, there was much he had to do. His two stumpy legs carried him away as fast as they could manage. But it simply wasn't fast enough, as the Crimson Commander had no use for him anymore. He decided to take care of the pests before he made his way to the castle. After all, there was a chance that slave could become a nuisance if a female spider managed to get her fangs into the unlucky creature. He took a bold leap into the abyss, landing with an immense force upon his 2 feet, before preparing for the slaughter to commence. Blue phosphorescent liquid began to spray in all directions as he removed head after head of his enemies. With no intention of being here all night, he activated the ability, Knife Dance. The flow of destruction smoothly traced its way from one winged spider to the next. Within mere moments, he had devastated the entire colony. After removing his blade from the skull of the final creature, a detail caught his eye. In all his time upon this planet, he had never come across a male and female spider in the same nest. He took it as a sign that something treacherous was afoot. All his armor knew was that it was time to feast, asking permission before he gorged himself. After all, this was his favorite meal. On his master's command, he began to devour the tasty treat. While his gluttonous armor went about his business, he scanned his surroundings. Within moments, he located what was undeniably the spider's nest. The signs of their passing could be seen through the gap in the wall. He began the ominous task of searching for his target, slicing through the threads one cocoon at a time. The sight was one that never ceased to amaze him. Each and every victim was willingly sucked dry. Thanks to the poison of the spiders, the pleasure they received was unmatched by anything they had experienced in life. None of the mummies were of interest to him. But what was indeed a problem. The single empty cocoon whose owner had managed to escape from the inside out. The discovery was exacerbated by the fact that the only reason why this would have been allowed was because the individual had been bitten by a female spider. Reluctant to bring this chase to an end, the Crimson Commander called out, ordering the slave to show himself. The commander's smooth words almost tricked him into revealing himself. Of course, he would be behind a rock. There was nothing in this cavern but rocks. Lito wasn't buying the lies from the mouth of this blue-skinned devil. He was simply fishing for an opportunity. Regardless of his actions, his death was assured. As the knight began his pointless game, Lito racked his brains for a way out of this mess. This unforgiving world had 3 races. 3. The yellow-skinned humans, with their unyielding numbers, their population, had spread across the face of this entire planet. 2. The green-skinned Volks, their timid nature meant they was forced into servitude long ago. 1. And the blue-skinned Elven, the apex predator that dominated this world. As the knight finished his countdown, Lito took the opportunity given to him and made his way out of hiding. The human's judgment surprised him. With new interest in the child, he inquired the age of the slave. Lito was 15, but it was only a distraction as he plotted his escape. With zero warning, a pain blossomed across his face. He dropped to the ground, clutching at his eyes as the knight commander assured him his eyes were put out, simply because he was plotting an escape. On a different day, it would have been his neck. But his interest was leading him to make unwise decisions. He ordered the escape artist to tell him the story of how a simple fork allowed him to escape captivity. And as a reward, if he managed to make him laugh, he would spare his life. Lito hesitated, debating the absurdity of the situation. But a tiny threat was all it took to get him started. He introduced himself, beginning the story with a tragedy that took place a half a year ago. On the day his parents were murdered by the elven race, him and his brother were turned into slaves. He ultimately ended up in the zoo of the royal family scooping shit. The smell was something that no matter how long he was around, he never got used to. As the days ticked by, he realized if he didn't change his circumstances, this would be his fate for the rest of his life. All he knew was that his brother was sold to another territory, and he was left knee-deep in dog shit. How just was a world where animals were fed better than a human? While they had all they could eat, he was barely functioning off of a bowl of porridge. He knew he had reached rock bottom when he ended a dog's life. If it wasn't for his reflexes, the caged beast would have put an end to him. While he sometimes wished it would all end, the reality was entirely different. He craved nothing more than freedom. From afar, the beast was a fearsome sight. He was known as Cerberus, the three-headed dog. But nothing could be farther from the truth. He stared daggers at the creature before realizing it too was looking for freedom. As he met the Cerberus' true eyes, he realized the beast was a handsome warrior, so he named him Sambil. The two would create a symbiotic relationship. He had a plan of escape and Sambil would be the key to it all. His green orc overseer was always cracking the whip. He could never shift enough shit to make him happy. Lito just couldn't compute the logic his captors were working with. How could he complete anything with the nutrition he was taking in? If only he got a little meat, he would be a powerful shit shifter. The audacity of the human was beyond believable. If he had to, he would beat the ideal of slavery into the child. He would either learn or die. Lito was pulled from his storytelling. The knight was seriously contemplating finishing what the orc started. He didn't sign up for the boring story of the human's life. He could either skip to the excitement of how the prince lost his eye, or they could move on to the inevitable. What he really wanted to know was how had the human managed to get close to the prince, who was always accompanied by his royal knights. Such an attack should have been theoretically impossible. Lito progressed the story to the evening of that very day. A female aristocrat by the name of Lady Bathory chose this day to visit the castle. Of all things, she was there to see the prince's Cerberus. The princess' head was on cloud 9 as he presented the beast to the aristocrat. Oh my! I mean, she was completely taken by the beast. With only 2 escorts, Lito knew there would never be a better opportunity than the one he was being presented. As he went about his chores, he eavesdropped on their conversation. The prince was planning to tame Sambil and use him in his coronation. He was hit by the realization that this child king was the one who took his family away. More precisely, the bastard had murdered his mother with his own 2 hands. The smell of shit drew the attention of the escort knight. He had 2 choices. He could either get lost, or face the wrath of the future king's chaperone. But Lito was slow to respond as the realization that his number 1 enemy was within his reach. He had no choice but to accelerate his plans. It was time to put the secret of the pen to use. His plan was a slow burn, starting over half a year ago. He stole 3 tree seeds from the garden and stashed them inside Sambil's lock. Over time, the plants slowly compromised its integrity. He was sure it had been a long time since it was capable of performing within its intended parameters. Lito retrieved a slab of meat and in front of the big wigs, he informed his partner that it was showtime. Slanging Sambil's dinner directly at the rude royal escort. The compromised lock shattered and the beast pounced. The escort was so in his feelings he didn't see the dangerous creature barreling down on him. Sambil began to feast as Lito went in for his kill. He screamed his intent as he dug his fork essentially to the pit of the prince's eyeball. If only he had more time, he could have continued his assault, but escape was his primary target. The Crimson Commander called the story off. He wasn't here for make-believe, he was here for the truth. Exactly how had a slave come by the dangerous weapon? The fork had been retrieved from the excrements of the Cerberus. The corner of the Crimson Commander's lips turned up oh so slightly. Before the full hysterics hit, the trash prince had been stabbed in the eye with a fork that was recovered from shit. The moment the beast began his rampage, Lito cautiously made his way into his carefully curated escape route. By sheer determination, he passed through the foul channel, directly under the awareness of half the palace staff, till he reached the point where all the castle's waste was discharged. He was sent sailing into a lagoon of freedom. As he came up for breath, he stared at what had been his prison for far too long, and made the declaration that he would become stronger. And one day he would dig out the prince's right eyeball. And when that happened, his death would soon follow. Beyond that, he attempted to run away from the servants, and his negligence caused him to fall into this cave. The story was all he hoped for, leaving the commander with exactly nothing to say. He began to rise, admitting that not only was the story interesting, it had been honestly funny. He truly wished he could keep his promise to spare the human's life. But it wasn't meant to be, as the child had been bitten by a spider. To be precise, a female green-eyed winged spider. He was sure the symptoms were beginning to set in. The rise of body temperature was an early sign. By now, the human's eyes should have been healed. His true reason for cutting Lito's eyes was to test the recoverability gifted to him by the spider. He was indeed impressed that a human child had the wherewithal to continue to pretend to be injured. Lito didn't believe his luck. For every inch he clawed out, the elf managed to take back a foot. The commander prepared his weapon as he explained that winged spiders reproduce in a very unique way. They inject their eggs into other creatures and grant special abilities to the host who incubates them. The process was a survival instinct that allowed the host the strength to carry their offspring to term. But the process wasn't something he wished on his worst enemy. Slowly, one's sanity would erode until all that was left was a vicious creature, whose only interest was consuming anything it could get its hands on. And the worst part was when it was time for the spiders to hatch, they would consume your innards before bursting out of your chest. The horrors left Lito in shock. How could there be a spider inside of him? Because of the joy his story brought the Crimson Commander, he would show the human a final mercy. He would send him into the next life, pain-free. Lito's time on this earth couldn't be over. His brother was counting on him. He couldn't die. The future he sought was still out there. Leaving him with no other option, the blue-skin elf would have to die this day. An overwhelming sensation ran over his body, as he felt pressure boiling up from his soul. An unbelievable feeling akin to pure power washed over him. At that very moment, he didn't feel as if his declaration was a simple boast anymore. As he sprung into the air, he decided this path was indeed worth a try. He came at his enemy backward, legs spread, in an attempt to conceal his attack, getting within millimeters of depriving the commander of his sight, before a fearsome blow that should have decapitated him came to rest on the new face guard he was sporting. Surprised, the commander wasted no time removing him from his presence, sending him crashing across the dark cave. He knew going forward, things were going to be a little difficult, seeing as how the mutation process had already begun. Lito slowly rose to his feet. His screams were reminiscent of a wounded wild beast. At first glance, the Crimson Commander knew trouble was incoming. The pain he was in was indescribable, as he glanced down at an arm, completely encased in metal. His shock was completely evident as the commander stirred unimpressed by the sight. As he began to contemplate the ramifications of what had just happened, a part of his brain reminded him that now wasn't the time. He had more pressing worries, as he dashed forward, new weapon in hand, in the attempt to take out the blue-skinned devil. With every passing moment, the commander was becoming more enamored by this little guy. But it wasn't enough to stop him from putting the adorable little fellow down. Lito barely saw the attack coming. He began to cough up blood, realizing the predicament he was in. In the highest tower of Cam Castle, the doctor diligently worked on the prince's eye. The blow was so devastating it would take nearly 2 months to heal. The moment he was finished, the prince demanded a mirror. From his demeanor, all parties knew this wasn't going to go well. The servant immediately complied. In an attempt to secure his life, he removed any sign of emotion from his face. The sight in the mirror stunned the future king to his core. The ramification of the day's events was finally sinking in. Foolishly, the the doctor attempted to persuade His Highness. Without so much as a word, he was tossed from the window. The scream could be heard until the moment he impacted the ground, which was followed by a more terrifying roar that echoed clear across the castle grounds. Sadly, the servant's actions hadn't been enough to spare him. He wanted that slave. The news that only servants were out looking for him didn't sit well with the prince. He ordered that all the soldiers be sent, but decided even that wasn't enough, he would go himself. A voice of reason slid into his awareness. The prince was at a crucial moment, and couldn't be distracted. The preparations have been meticulously completed. The smooth-faced aristocrat reminded him he had promises he needed to keep, once he became king. She hit the nail on the head. Her words were exactly what was needed to calm him down. Lito clutched at his stomach, realizing he was no match for the experienced elf. Even though he failed to land a single blow, he refused to give up on his dreams of reuniting with the only family he had left. The determination in his eyes was admirable, causing the Crimson Commander to offer the child a second chance. He had a collection of warriors who only fought for him, a force of elite soldiers handpicked and trained by him. He offered to spare Lito's life, and as a reward he would remove the spider eggs from his body. Trust just wasn't something he could freely give. After all, the commander was here to kill him. How could the blueskin elf so easily change his mind? The answer was simple. While rare, it was possible for one to be bitten and to not lose their sanity. But more than that, he just liked the kid's spunk. Going forward, he would need to follow one simple rule: to obey the Crimson Knight's every command. And since he was tasked with killing the human race, he would have to be okay with that. Lito realized that accepting meant he would become a traitor to humanity. There was a good chance he would build a reputation as the green-eyed demon from hell. Was he willing to perpetrate the same crimes that were done to him, to others of his kind? Without a second thought, he agreed to join the elves' forces. This was his only option to live. He would take every scrap given, until he found the opportunity to escape. The commander could clearly sense Lito's intent. The human had made an excellent choice. He reached out, his weapon arcing towards Lito's head. In that moment, a million thoughts went through his head. Realizing it was his responsibility to duck, as there was an enemy at his rear. In a few smooth moves, the intruder put distance between him and his targets. Lito glanced upwards, at a sight straight out of a nightmare, that resembled a servant of Cthulhu. The Crimson Knight knew a member of the assassination unit Stiletto when he saw one. Such an occurrence, so close to Kem Castle, could only mean the prince had thrown in with Lady Bathory. But sending only a single assassin? Who did they think he was? He was expecting an answer, only to remember that assassins of the Stiletto unit were famous for being mute. He just had to tempt fate, as an unknown number of combatants slowly encircled them. Their numbers slowly continued to grow, until what could only be their leader let out a silent shrill. To think that his enemies would send such low-ranking losers in an attempt to assassinate him. The Crimson Commander simply wasn't impressed. Lito had no idea what they were facing, or what exactly had he stumbled into. At this point, it really didn't matter. This was the exact opportunity he needed to make his escape. As the ghouls of Cthulhu began their assault, Lito prepared to make his great escape. The moment the fighting broke out, he would intentionally pull up the rear. And when the coast was clear, he would slide through the gap in the cave wall. The ghouls charged in with no regard for their lives. With a smooth motion, the Crimson Commander sent his first head flying, as its body continued its forward flow. Lito was stunned as the enemy charged past, showing absolutely no interest in him. Their target was clearly the blue-skinned elf. He wasted no time. This was much more than the opening he had been hoping for. The orchestrator of this attack simply watched the little human go. Having no interest in the kid, after all, the spider bite would eventually take him from this world. It wasn't like the kid was even his target. He was here for the life of Cain Ballstein. He would bide his time until the perfect opening revealed itself. And when that moment came, he intended to slit Cain's throat. It didn't matter how strong the target was, eventually, his ghouls would wear him down. The commander continued to decimate the ghouls, intrigued by how easy it was to remove their heads. But eventually, he bored of the game. Activating Knife Dance, he slaughtered an endless amount in a mere moment. Just for fun, he decided to end his attack with a blow that left a ghoul in two distinct pieces. The opportunity the assassin was hoping for was slowly evaporating. Cain Ballstein was indeed an amazing fighter as he faced down his last two enemies with a silly smile on his face. The assassin began his approach. He was the shadow in the dark. With his secret technique, he was a precise killing machine. Not once had anyone managed to perceive his presence. Unless the individual had eyes in the back of their head, it was simply impossible. If only he had done more research on his target. Lito made it through the gap, skipping for joy at his stroke of luck. The idiots behind him could wipe each other out for all he cared. He had his priorities, and first, he needed to find a human settlement. If he managed that, there had to be a chance that a doctor could remove the creature from his body. As soon as he was free from this curse, he would continue the search for his brother. Eventually, he would gain the strength he needed to enact his revenge. The list was starting to pile up. He would take out the prince. Then he turned his attention to the blue-skinned devil. Lastly, he would find those green skins that put him in this predicament. He fully intended to remove each and every one of their heads. If it wasn't for his forked arm, he wondered what the chances were that he would have found an exit. Thankfully, it was capable of slicing smoothly into the cliffside, allowing him to exit where he entered. The sight of the sky invigorated his soul. Sadly, that ugly blue-skinned devil was highly likely dead by now. It would be hard, but he was sure he could live with the fact that he couldn't gain the vengeance he desired. As he raised his head, his soul sunk back to the bottom of the pit. Commander Cain couldn't believe it had taken the brat so long to make it to the surface. Instead of obeying the order he was given, to follow his master, incomplete sentences fell from his mouth. And before he knew it, he had been slammed against the ground. Commander Cain currently wasn't in a good mood. He roughly pinned Lito to the ground with his foot. If the human tried to escape again, he would kill him. Beyond that, he had no intentions of putting up with his subordinate's mouth. Lito assured him he understood, as the commander ordered him to call him master from now on. Their first order of business would be to put as much distance between them and this place as they could. There was almost a guarantee that assassins would arrive any moment. Lito climbed to his feet. If the look in his eyes could kill, this blue-skinned bastard would be dead. But instead of acting on his feelings, he simply answered with a yes, master. Knife Knight was a nickname he earned by cutting through humans without a second thought. On his first march, he led the Red Army on a crimson crusade against countless bands of humans. He was a hero who earned his people's admiration and at the same time installed fear in the human race. Among the 13 knights from the critically acclaimed 13 Night restaurants, Cain Ballstein was by far the strongest. The smooth face, Madame Bathory's heart broke at the idea that she had to put down such a man. She fully intended to preserve his corpse, otherwise she knew she could never live with herself. The soon-to-be king knew if he was to fully take on his title, he had to put down his people's most fearsome warrior. If he didn't, he would always be at risk of having the Red Army marched upon his gates. After all, it was the army that once belonged to his father, an army that should have been his birthright. But the Crimson Commander had slid in and corrupted the minds of his soldiers. Madame Bathory assured him that her stiletto assassins were relentless. Once marked, no one was capable of escaping the death that would follow. Not Cain, or even the king. Things could have been so different, but his father felt the need to pass the kingdom that was his inheritance to a mere subject. His father, the currently seated king, could die right alongside his chosen one. The prince marched towards the door, ordering his guard to gather some useful men. Madame Bathory, surprised by the order, inquired if the prince was planning to hunt down Cain Ballstein himself. The future king thought the idea was absurd. If he did that, what use was she to him? His target was the bastard who had the nerve to take his eye. They marched into the mountains, Lito doing all he could to keep up with his master. Keeping his promise was one thing, but the intel he gained from not doing so would be invaluable. He needed to know where they were headed and when the spider eggs would be removed from his body. Cain couldn't believe the brazen human continued to push his boundaries. If he didn't soon learn his place, more drastic measures would have to be taken. They were currently headed west towards his army. And the human didn't have to worry about his life. The spider hatchling would be removed on their journey. Even after being reprimanded, Lito continued to run his mouth. But this time, his questions merely fell on deaf ears. Freeing himself was so tempting, all he needed to do was stab his captor in the back, and it would all be over. His hatred for the elven race narrowed his thinking. The blue-skinned devil was simply using him, and when he was done he would casually toss him away. How could there ever be trust between the two? The back of his head was oh so tempting. He could do this. A single strike was all it took. Even an elven wouldn't survive a direct blow to the back of the neck. Regardless of how strong he was, he would die. The sky turned red, as the elven kept his promise of removing the spider hatchlings. Just not in the way he ever imagined. He instantly snapped back to his senses. There was no reason for him to jeopardize his life at the moment. If he kept his eyes open, a perfect opportunity would eventually arise. As soon as he caught up with his master, he let his intent slip from his mouth. But quickly covered it up, using the weather as an excuse. He would have to be careful in the future. The elves' ears were extremely sharp. Tall volks and small volks. With their pointed pig-like ears and imposing fangs, both the tall and small volks possessed striking features. Their pupils and hair were as dark as night, and their skin had a distinctive shade of green. In terms of physical stature, tall volks boasted human-like proportions, while small volks were roughly half the size of their taller counterparts. As a subordinate race within the Elven Kingdom, tall volks primarily found themselves in military roles, lending their strength to the realm's defense. Meanwhile, small volks played essential roles as healers, attendants, and devoted servants, contributing significantly to the kingdom's well-being. Source: Albania Continent Encyclopedia by Jaina Elliott. The Blueskin Elven had slowly increased their pace until they reached an all-out sprint. Even with his enhanced body, Lito wasn't conditioned for this. Only the thought of having the spiders removed from his body kept him moving. But the bastard was relentless, pulling farther and farther away by the second. Until he was forced to call this grueling assault to a halt. Only just restraining his tongue when referring to his master. Completely out of breath, he pleaded with the elf. There had to be another way. At the very least, sprinting was out of the question for him. If he continued at this pace, he would die. With assassins on their trail, footing it was the only way forward. He didn't understand where this unreasonable beast got the energy to keep pushing. Cain began to softly chuckle. And that soft chuckle turned into an all-out howl. And this was the crazy bastard who was attempting to stay undetected. Lito wondered how messed up in the head you had to be to find any humor in the situation they were currently in. When the elf began to sprint, all of a sudden his soul fled his body. And just as perplexing as he began, he pulled to a stop. Cain's eyes were affixed to the shadows creeping across the landscape, deciding that now was a good time to take that break. As he finished off the remaining ghouls, his armor warned him of an incoming attack. In that moment, the stiletto member realized his mistake. As his eyes met the monstrosity before him, all he could do was make his efforts worth it. As his head made its way from his body, he spent his last few moments of life regretting underestimating his enemy. If only Cain had been a little quicker on the draw, the trash would have never had an opportunity to nick his neck. Poison, it just had to be poison. He spent way too much time engrossed in the honor of the battlefield that he managed to forget that poisons were the fundamentals of assassination. In his opinion, the lot of them were nothing more than dishonorable cowards. Lito paused from the task of digging a hole for his master's sake, to ponder why his master would relinquish such vulnerable knowledge. The poison of an assassin had to be extremely potent, if only his enemy would simply drop dead. Cain had no problem disappointing the human. Sure, if he was a mere human, he would have died from the deception of the assassin. But as an elf, it was nothing more than a slight setback, cured by rest and staying out of the sunlight. Besides, his armor was in the process of neutralizing the poison for him, so it wouldn't take long before he was back on his feet. Not only was he dealing with the unreasonable monster, but the elf had the nerve to have a complete ass of an armor set. Cain was done talking. The trash needed to get out of his hole now. Lito rushed out of the hole. The bastard could have merely asked. Something was getting to him. Why was his master being pursued by other elven when he was one of their kind? The elf warned Lito that not only was he being brazen, but he was pushing the line. He climbed into the hole, instructing the human that he would remain asleep until he recovered. Never in Cain's wildest thoughts did he believe he would have to sleep underground, even after leaving the battlefield. He would need to learn how to manage his expressions, otherwise, his intrusive thoughts would get him killed. Cain assured him. Everyone who had been capable of removing the spider eggs from his stomach among the human race was long dead. But the kid was lucky, for he knew an individual who could get the job done. And if he made a break for it, his master promised, death would ensue. Lito stared into Cain's ominous eyes as his head slowly retreated below the surface. Until only him and a patch of dirt remained. Only then did he realize he was being left alone in the elements, with nothing to keep him company but his thoughts. He most definitely wasn't tamed. He was merely thinking of his survival. He was in the middle of nowhere with zero clue of where they were headed. And if he made the wrong choice, the one-eyed elven would find him. It was surprising that he and the crazy bastard were in the same boat. For some reason, he too was being hunted by his kind. At this point, he could only trust that the elven was capable of removing the eggs from his body. For the time being, he had no choice but to stick by his side. His plans going forward were to follow the crazy bastard until the eggs were removed, then he would find the opportunity to escape. To increase his strength while searching for his brother. With his ultimate goal being to grow stronger and avenge his parents. And if the opportunity presented itself, he would also take out the crazy bastard. The castle was selling their slaves off to a place called Siren when his brother was sent away. He stared on at his new appendage, realizing going to an inhabited place would pose him new problems. Not only was the giant fork heavy, but with it, he was sure it made him a monster. As he daydreamed over the possibility that once the spider hatchling was removed, his monstrosity of an arm would also return to normal. A glint of light caught his attention, giving him only moments to react. He was under attack. An arrow was embedded into the tree where his head was only moments ago. Lito stayed low, as he scanned the horizon for the enemy's location. To his surprise, two individuals were standing in the distance, casually chatting with no worries of his retaliation. They couldn't believe their luck. A human in the wild could only be the slave that stabbed Prince Romer in the eye, before making a bid for freedom. If it turned out to be the right human, they would be up 50 silver. Essentially a month's worth of earnings. And if it wasn't, they would have done their part in eradicating another human. The luck on this kid, he hadn't been free for more than a day and here he was running into them. With 50 silver at stake, the hunt began. The two tall Volks dashed in, giving Lito no choice but to retreat. The archer's eye turned out to be on the money. It was indeed a human. The marksman whipped an arrow out and sent it flying towards their game. His aim was true. If all went well, it would bury itself into the back of the human's head. Lito turned at the last moment using his new arm as a shield, sending the arrow ricocheting in the opposite direction. They weren't just after a mere human. This kid was a winker. There was no way they would be able to capture him alive. He had to be put down before he fully mutated. The archer was a bit worried. Could the human's actions have been a coincidence? For what were the chances that the winker had the wherewithal to deflect his arrow? With his new arm, Lito's speed had reduced drastically. He knew if he continued as he was, they would catch him. He dodged another arrow, this time while on the run, forcing the archer to realize what they were up against. Hopefully, it wasn't too much of a problem as he never traveled anywhere solo. The teammates had padded the field, sending the human directly into an oncoming attack. The kick he received would have been enough to kill a normal human, but the winker merely absorbed the blow, crashing hard as he slid to a stop on the hard ice-covered forest floor. Coming to rest at the base of a large tree, he was given no room to breathe. The incoming arrow ensured he had to stay on his toes. The two hunters were piling it on hard, laying attacks down one after the other. The axeman's blow should have taken off his head. The amount of luck this kid was showing was simply unreal. With only a moment to make his decision, the kid had again squirmed away from death's door. With the opportunity being delivered to him on a silver platter, he plunged his fork into his attacker's leg. The green-skinned Voke howled in rage before sending the kid flying with a kick to the chest. This time Lito was prepared, controlling his momentum with the use of his fork. He couldn't believe he had allowed himself to fall into the trap of trusting in Elvin. Instead of sticking by his side, that Elvin bastard went to sleep, leaving him up to defend himself. As he raged at his circumstances, this moment of hesitation was all the archer needed to plant an arrow into his neck. After careful calculation, the Voke had finally done his part. As Lito began to lose consciousness, past events flashed into his view. As he dropped to his knees, he knew he wasn't that kid anymore. The archer was surprised to see the human struggling at death's doorstep. He firmly grasped the arrow, determined to survive until he reunited with his brother. The spider's poison reacted to his will, causing his eyes to grow green and horns to protrude from his head. He stood up, ripping the arrow out of his neck as he announced his defiance to the world. The Volts knew trouble when they saw it. The winker was mutating. The archer immediately replaced her arrow, knocking the human to the ground. She rushed over to confirm her kill, only to be reminded that it would take much more than a simple arrow to put a winker down for good. He raised his axe up high, delivering his final words that the kid had no one to blame for his luck of being born a human. As he prepared to remove the winker's head, a distinct female voice could be heard echoing through the forest, pulling the hunter's attention from the neck of their prey. The words of the female simply made no sense. It only took a moment for the new threat to draw their full attention. Whatever it was continued to repeat the same phrase over and over. The female Voke didn't play with stupid. She was ready to kill whatever it was if it didn't immediately reveal itself. The axeman insisted she think twice about her decision. If it turns out to be a noble, they would be up shit creek without a paddle. She released her arrow, knowing there was no way an Elven would be out in a place where only hunters and prey existed. The arrow pierced directly into the center of the darkness, silencing the rambling of the creature. The two were completely vigilant as they waited for confirmation of the kill. The archer, being the sharper of the two, immediately spotted the incoming attacker. But the creature was too fast, ripping her comrade away from her in an instant. She knew at that moment she had picked a fight with the devil. At that very moment, the hunter had become the prey. A tear ran out of her eye as she realized she had no chance of escaping. His father had done all he could to protect them, but in the end, it only received him an arrow to the chest. With his father dead, his big brother took on the responsibility of caring for him. He clustered to the ground, as best he could, in a clump of children to not draw attention to his size. The two watched on as the adults were killed, one after the other. But their mother didn't go easy. She struggled, clinging to any chance of survival. Her nails dug into the enemy's hand, giving her a chance to escape. As she rushed away, everything seemed to be moving in slow motion for the brothers. The moment her blood began gushing from her body was a moment they would never forget, along with the face of the elf who did it. The sadistic smile on his face would be carved into their souls forever. Lito's eyes shot open, the word mom reverberating through his head. To his surprise, someone very familiar was sniffing at his neck. He jumped up, unsure of how much he could trust the beast. But Samuel's submissiveness instantly eased his worries. Till this very moment, he had had no idea if the Cerberus had managed to escape. The beast licked at his face, happy to be accepted. That was the moment when Lito remembered the predicament he was in, jumping up to protect them from his enemies. But it seemed someone had already taken care of the two hunters, leaving a mess in their wake. He had a suspicious idea of exactly who it was, turning to Sandal, to see if he owed the beast his gratitude. The words that could only mean he wasn't alone when it came to owing someone gratitude reverberated through his head. A range of emotions ran through Lito's head. He had no idea the Cerberus had such talents. While it was awesome, it was still entirely too creepy. The sound of electricity drew his attention to the wound on his neck closing over. The power the spider had bestowed upon him was astonishing. Sandal made sure he knew that healing like that was beyond creepy, but also awesome. Since it seemed the two were fated to be together, Lito invited the Cerberus to join them. Sandal nodded his head, becoming a willing member of the team. Realizing that things could possibly get out of hand, Lito explained to Sandal that there was another party joining them. He was a crazy elf bastard, but he didn't have to worry. They would only be with him for a little while before they would dump the loser and head in their own direction. As if he was there the whole time, Cain made his presence known. Inquiring about the appearance of the Cerberus and how peculiar it was. The two stared into the darkness, only able to see the face of the ass backward armor. Never in his life had he seen a Cerberus following a human. Lito believed it was highly suspicious that his master bastard only showed up once the trouble was over. Before there could be trouble, he reassured the elf that he wasn't attempting to escape. Which was obvious as he could see the bodies littering the ground. The two were human hunters. They specialized in capturing humans and selling them into slavery. He was pleasantly surprised that his charge had even managed to survive as long as he did. Sandal didn't like this situation one bit. He stepped forward to what was obviously their enemy. The Cerberus had no intention of surrendering without a fight. He bared his teeth, letting his feelings be known. The eyes of the two monsters locked, and Sandal realized he might have made a mistake. Cain was a demon from hell, unlike any blueskin he had ever come across. At the sight of what lay before him, Sandal's survival instincts kicked in. The pup backed up as his hair stood on end. And to Lito's surprise, the once fearsome Cerberus shrunk before his very eyes. What in the world? Sandal had been the most fearsome thing Lito had ever laid his eyes on. The pup crouched between his legs as Cain explained the instincts of a Cerberus. It was said that when one encounters a strong opponent, it becomes smaller. An obvious symbol of submission. A simple evolutionary trait that was meant to secure their survival on the extremely hostile planet. Lito recognized the hierarchy system for what it was. Cain was surprised he understood this, and reminded him that it also applied to humans. Having such a willing companion was invaluable. The little beast had a wealth of skills. So, it would be wise if the human took good care of it. The two marched directly into the sunrise. Before their very eyes, everything around them began to light up. Lito knew he had to gather as much intel on his enemy as he could, if he stood any chance of escaping. He immediately began to lay the questions into his master. His master, going to sleep before the sun rose, made no sense to him. He was sure the blue-skinned kind hated the sunlight. Cain inquired where he had obtained this information. But it was simply an observation. His time in captivity had prompted him to the habits of the nobles. They rarely spend any time in the daylight, waiting until after the sun went down to do anything meaningful. He kept the fact that it was nighttime when his kind attacked his village to himself. All his life he was led to believe that if the blue-skins stepped into the sunlight, they would burn to death. But obviously, that wasn't the truth. Cain assured him that something like that had to come from the fears of humans. It was true that most elven hated the sunlight. But he, on the other hand, preferred the bright rays of the sun. In his opinion, the pitch-black darkness didn't suit this planet. After all, in hell, there must always be the light of a burning fire. Lito immediately showed the crazy bastard what he felt about his stupid opinion. The elf's arm whipped up, making him believe that his childish gesture had been revealed. But he was merely ordered to get down as Cain scanned the horizon. Lito became serious. If he didn't, a simple mistake could cost him his life. Elven, the mystical blue-skinned beings. Although they bear a striking resemblance to humans in their overall appearance, the elven race stands out with their unique feature: vibrant blue skin. What truly sets them apart are their exceptional physical capabilities and astonishing regenerative powers, enabling them to swiftly mend even the most minor of wounds. Despite their remarkable attributes, the elven population remains notably smaller when compared to the vast numbers of humans and Volks inhabiting the Albanian continent. Yet, their relative scarcity doesn't diminish their influence, for they reign supreme as the dominant race, holding sway over the various other races in the region. Within their society, the Elven are revered as nobility, their distinctive characteristics and abilities making them the undisputed rulers of the Albanian continent. Source: Albania Continent Encyclopedia. By Jaina Elliott. Kane cautiously peeked over the boulder. They had somehow stumbled upon a guard post, in the middle of nowhere. They had at least two choices. In Lito's opinion, they should destroy the guard tower and continue on their way. But life wasn't that simple. If a single soldier laid their eyes upon Kane, they would immediately use the marking. The item was commonly used among the military. The marking was a whistle attached to the front of an arrow. When shot into the air, it would produce a distinct sound. There was no doubt once this happened, soldiers and assassins would swarm their location. Lito realized if this were to occur, there was no chance he would survive such an encounter. Kane glanced back, smiling at the young human. At this point, they really didn't have a choice. They were too far into the thick of it, too far in, to turn back now. Lito wasn't down with the way the elf was staring at him. Nothing good could come from such an expression. While the guards wanted to do nothing more than rest. There was no way they could do that with the sound of a human begging for help. The commotion reluctantly pulled the Voke from his stupor. The no-nonsense Voke sighted his weapon and demanded the identity of the trespasser. Lito raised both his hands, announcing that he was a slave from Cam Castle. He begged them not to shoot. He had lost his way and simply needed their assistance. The story didn't sit well with the soldier, and he didn't take kindly to being treated like a fool. If it wasn't for the goofy Voke, Lito would have been shot down that very moment. The opportunity for a come-up was right in front of them. All they needed to do was take him in and keep him until their shift was over. If they played their cards right, there was a good chance they would score some meat for returning the runaway. The farce had gone just as Kane had suspected. The guards eagerly invited the human inside. Lito was straight pissed. There was no way this dumb plan had worked. From the moment he was thrown on the chopping block, he knew an arrow would end up embedded in his body before he made it anywhere near that tower. Kane's plan was simple. He could use the fact that he was a slave from Cam Castle as his shield. He knew not a single soldier who wanted to incur the wrath of the royals. Once the human was in range, it wasn't his concern how the guards were dealt with. If he wished to kill them, that was up to him. His only objective was to secure the whistle. The plan was good and all, but how would anyone fail to notice that he was a winker? The big metal fork on his right arm was a dead giveaway. Kane stared at the foolish human. If he believed his arm was a problem, then he should simply change it back. After all, it was his arm, so he should know how. Lito squatted, concentrating on his right arm, willing it to return to normal. Sambo watched his master, intent on missing not a second of this spectacle. But regardless of how hard he concentrated, nothing happened. He gave up, at a loss for how to accomplish the impossible. Without more detailed instructions, how would he ever achieve such a task? The moment he surrendered, he knew he had made the wrong choice. The elf became outright hostile. His initial attack only trimmed away a few hairs, but it was enough to send him scurrying away from the danger. Little Samdal was intent on protecting his savior. But a single glance was all it took to put him in his place. The human's hair was a bit unkempt, so they would solve this problem the old-fashioned way. Kane would commence with a haircut. If Lito's arm wasn't back to normal before he was done, he would trim it back as well. He began the procedure, sending hair follicles scattering on the wind. The arc of his blade began to fly in every direction. Lito knew the crazy bastard was serious. If he didn't complete his task, his arm would be removed. The look in his master's eyes was all he needed to understand the sanity of the blue-skinned bastard. As fear ran through his soul, before his very eyes the metal began to warp. As the smooth slices of the crimson blade continued to rain down on his head, true horror filled his body when the blade ceased movement. Cain announced that his work was completed. His blade slowly arced downward as he began the process of removing the arm. A whimper of protest escaped his lips. He had done it. There was no need for the elf to continue. Cain, with a smile that was reminiscent of a serial killer, was sure he had once heard a phrase that whether it was humans or elven, people tended to grow the fastest when put in extreme situations. While Lito appreciated the freedom that came with a bare arm, the trauma he went through to get it would only fuel his determination to kill that elf one day. The simple Volk dug for gold, as he pondered how the human got out of the castle. Lito hurriedly explained the circumstances behind his peculiar situation. The Volk clutched at his boogie as the suspenseful story unfolded. The human was being forced to repair the castle walls when a single mistake caused him to slip. Luckily, he fell into the river and was washed away. The Volk narrowed his eyes, after most likely snacking on his treat. Even for him, the story sounded too miraculous. Lito assured him while unbelievable, it happened exactly as he told it. As the foolish folk began to guffaw, Lito couldn't believe they had bought the story hook, line and sinker. Cain patiently waited for the bloodshed to begin. There was simply no way the kid had what it took to accomplish the goal without killing his targets. If they were going to get the arrow, it would only be through violence. Only those who could ruthlessly take away the lives of others had any chance of surviving in this world. He wanted to see if this kid had what it took. Cain's bloodthirsty mood sent shivers running down the Cerberus's spine. Better yet, what he needed to know was if the kid had what it took to become a demon. It didn't take long for Lito to locate his target, for the item was being kept on standby. He had two Volks, each on the opposite end of the spectrum, one extremely uptight and the other extremely relaxed. In such a situation, how would he manage to retrieve the prize? Reluctantly, he admitted defeat. There was no way for him to proceed other than to kill the two innocent Volks. At the slightest thought of the battle to come, his body began to transform. But could he do it? Could he murder two people for his own betterment? As he forced away his soft nature, he knew if he went forward with such a mentality it would only get him killed. But unluckily, that was the very moment when the reality of what he was doing was forced before his eyes. The serious Volk had a family. His daughter was only 2 months old. He dropped his head as he listened to the story of a stranger. The story of how the newborn was able to change the Volk's life caused his form to slowly revert to normal. The Volk's life had been decided. With one more mouth to feed, his current guard job left him struggling to meet those requirements, forcing him to contemplate heading towards the battlefield to meet his family's basic needs, something any father should strive for. He quickly snapped out of the spell as the Volk began to dig his own grave. The money he was attempting to make would come at the cost of human lives. Lito's thoughts went back to the day his life changed forever. Who were the accomplices of the deeds that were done that day? Who dragged away his mother and murdered his neighbors? He couldn't forget, the blue and the green bastards savagely murdered his family. All of them were the enemies of humanity. They thought nothing of putting his kind down. Why should he be any different? This was nothing more than revenge. Before his arm could fully form, he managed to put down the foolish folk. As he rushed towards the father who was nothing more than a human killer, Lito's surprise attack was enough to put him in the position to send the crossbow flying. But the Volk's experience kicked in as he countered with a blow to the face, which put Lito on the defensive. Instead of following up on his attack, the Volk made the unwise decision to charge for his weapon. Before he made it halfway there, the kid was already on the move, coming down with a blow that was sure to do irreparable damage. The Volk begged for his life. He had a family. What would come of his 2-month-old daughter? With what could only be assumed to be his last breath, he begged the human to spare his life. The failure of a royal guard sprinted through the snow. Wasting as little time as possible, he unnecessarily leaped directly into a village, coming down with a landing reminiscent of any superhero. The common Volk simply stared at the overzealous blue skin. As the two's eyes crossed, the Volk was asked if a human kid had passed through this village. The common Volk assured him he hadn't seen as much as a rat, let alone a human. Prince Romer sauntered into the village, surrounded by his entourage of collected soldiers. His failure of a royal guard ensured him all was well. They had eyes across the land, keeping a lookout for a lone human. Besides, the slave was unfamiliar with these lands, so it wouldn't be long before he was dragged in. There was no need for the prince to belittle himself by insisting on searching for the scoundrel. The prince mulled over the knight captain's words. In the far distant past there was an animal known as a horse. Nowadays, it's a rare species that's extremely hard to come by. It was always something that he really wanted. Because of it, he learned that he would never be at ease unless he obtained what he desired. After all, his father always told him he should obtain what he wanted with his own hands. So he was determined to get them himself. The eyes of that slave will be dug out with his own two hands. And once he retrieved his prize, he would cut the human into little bits and feed it to that wild dog. A local Volk saw no choice but to impose herself on the young royal. The condition for living was becoming extremely difficult. With the drought spreading across the lands, their crops were failing. But regardless of this, their land's lease payment had been doubled. If they didn't get help, this winter would be their last. She begged the prince if he could part with something, anything. She made the unforgivable mistake of touching his clothes. As she asked for at least something to feed the babe. He was simply appalled that the filthy creature was asking for his help. Her woes piqued his interest, and he decided that he would help after all. He would remove her hands so that she could feed the child. Or better yet, he decided he could take her whole arm, which she could use to feed the entire village. Very few of his men were capable of watching this spectacle, averting their eyes as their liege continued. After all, it was known that it didn't take much for Volks to survive. He ordered the old Volk to stay still. He would remove her arm in a way that would also tenderize it in the process. With a sadistic smile on his face and joy in his eyes, Prince Romer swung his sword towards the Volks, caring not whose life he destroyed in the process. A distinct piercing noise, that could only be the marking, echoed across the landscape. Everyone's heads swiveled toward the mountain's cape. With a hint of determination, the prince ordered his men to move. They had to reach the guard post before their prey could escape. Lito bent over doing his best to compose himself. The realization that he was a murderer, that he had just killed someone, ripped through his being. But he quickly shoved it aside. It simply wasn't that big a deal. He stared down on the two Volks. There was no way that the blame fell on his back. It was all their fault, for being born Volks. Now that that was handled, he needed to figure out what the sound was that went off while he was in the middle of taking care of the two guards. He was taken aback, as off in the distance it seemed he had company. Lito dropped into cover but realized it was possibly too late. One of the guards down below had marked them with the arrow. The distinct noise of someone pulling their last breath pulled his attention. He cautiously peeked over the rail. His eyes landed on Kane and two dead Volks. As he rushed from the tower, Kane explained that their luck had simply ran out. It seemed they had ran into the changing of the guards. What were the chances that they would pass through here when the guards were changing shifts? Regardless, the soldiers would be on their way. They needed to move now. Lito couldn't help but wonder if all he had done was in vain. Before he had the chance to harp on the situation, Kane congratulated him on becoming a vagrant of hell. He was now officially a little demon. Lito starred on, having no idea what the crazy bastard was on about. With no time to waste, the three set out, rushing across the frozen terrain as if their life depended on it. At this point, they were done with sneaking across the countryside. Anyone who laid their eyes on them could snitch to their heart's content. Without his arm dragging him down, the two were able to make good time. In no time the two put the open tundra behind them as they reached what could only be described as a canyon. Even without his arm, the months of being a slave were taking its toll. Kane pushed his charge, for once they made it through the canyon, they would enter a forest that would give them the cover they needed to move safely. Lito just couldn't go much longer. Terrible pains were shooting through his stomach. Cain sighed. Their time was running out. Stomach pains were a prelude to the spider hatchling hatching. His eyes grew wide. Their luck was indeed shot. They didn't have the time for this. He grabbed Lito by the collar and forced him into the canyon proper. Samdal trudged along, having no problem keeping up with the two. Cain rested his back against the canyon wall with a smile on his face. He announced that they had company. Lito couldn't believe that at the pace they were making, that the soldiers had managed to catch them. But the inexperienced human was wrong. The person after them was most definitely an assassin. And it was only a matter of time before they made their presence known. The two sat by the riverside, scanning the horizon in all directions. After a prolonged amount of time, Lito was starting to feel scammed. He hadn't been able to spot a single sign of an attacker. As he announced this to Cain, the response he received was cryptic. What the elf was feeling was an intuition, also known as a sixth sense. It wasn't something you could simply see. With experience, especially the kind received on the battlefield, you began to perceive all sorts of things. On the battlefield, it was easy to spot the madness and fear that ran rampant among its participants. But there were others. Fiery rage could be seen when a soldier reached his peak. But more than anything, cold death reigned supreme. No matter where you turned, it reared its face. But regardless of who you were or what side you were on, in some form or another, all emotions could be found when the war machine raged. A soldier quickly realizes that once all those emotions collide, the only thing that remained was solitude. When the blueskin got like this, he just simply didn't know what to think. All you knew, after spending time in a place like that, was that you can feel what the eyes couldn't see. Without a doubt, he knew there was a killing intent focused directly toward him. The enemy finally showed himself, and to their astonishment, he was going to face them head-on. At the end of the river, the assassin lingered, nothing more than a shadow at this distance. As he perched upon a rock, sickle held high, he sliced across his front, showing his skill as the simple gesture ripped through the water. As the aftermath splashed up and across his body, he simply vanished. Normally, Cain wouldn't need to explain to his companion. But in this case, he felt it was probably wise to warn Lito that the assassin was incoming. His skill was so extraordinary that he brought water droplets with him as he dived down towards his enemy. The waves of danger warned Cain of the incoming attack. He easily dodged, leaving the blow headed directly for Lito's face. It was too late for him to do anything to change this outcome. As his life flashed before his eyes, Cain came to the rescue. The back kick to the enemy's head was enough to save him from certain death. The assassin recovered, landing easily, as Cain left Lito's side to rush his talented enemy. He came in hard, thrusting inwards with both his blades seemingly cornering his enemy. But the assassin had no problems escaping upwards, reversing his flow and coming down with an attack of his own. The two fiercely traded blows before coming to a stalemate that stopped them in their tracks. The assassin retreated away from danger, landing on the opposite riverbank. Cain was impressed, especially since the assassin only had one arm. With the finger upon his lone arm, the assassin merely pointed toward his enemy, before gesturing downwards. The ass's backward armor had received damage and was struggling to repair itself. It was having a hard time. The process of neutralizing the poison in his master's body had left him in an extremely weakened state. It really didn't bother Cain much. It had really been a while since he felt such excitement. His heart was barely able to restrain itself. The energy that was emitting from his fearsome opponent was oh, so tantalizing. Watching the two battle set Lito's heart ablaze. As time slowly slipped by, he realized that sticking with the crazy bastard was turning out to be his best chance at survival. Seeing as how this was the case, there was no reason why he couldn't score a few brownie points before he made his grand escape. He decided to put the skill he used to dismantle the two Volks on display. As soon as he made his intentions known, he was told to shut up and sit down. If he intervened in any way, his master would kill him himself. The blow was extremely sharp, seeing as how he only wished to help. He set his ass down and relieved his frustration, by venting to the only one who would lend him his ear. In the process, he ended up adding a new phrase to the Cerberus's vocabulary. He was sure his elf would win, but he really wished the bastard would take a few serious blows in the process. He found himself silently rooting for the one-armed masked assassin. After their interruption, the two returned to trading blows. Cain was alive, in a way he hadn't been in a long time. Pressing his opponent with all he had, he again forced the assassin to retreat. But this time it was strategic, as he chose to use the river as cover. Within moments of entering, he had placed himself in a position to strike. But Cain was just too experienced, easily deflecting the blow, forcing the assassin to retreat to his favorite hangout. Suddenly, the shoe had been placed on the other foot, as Cain returned the gesture from earlier. Somewhere, in their brief exchange, he had managed to open a seam in his enemy's cloak. To his astonishment, the garment began to repair itself before his very eyes. This was completely unexpected. How had an assassin come to possess a living armor? As the damage was completely erased, it seemed as if the armor shook in the wind to show that it was nonplussed by the attack. The assassin sat there with his gaze upon his target. His feelings were able to be transmitted without having to utter a single word. The armor wasn't going to make a difference after Cain finished with his enemy. He would simply feed it to Chiron, the ass-backward armor. These short stints were fun and all, but Cain craved more, demanding that the two continue their exchange. Sambil's sharp senses picked up a sound that forced him to become extremely agitated. Lito followed the Cerberus's lead, only to lay his eyes upon their true pursuers. He immediately dropped into cover. This battle that his master seemed so fond of was going to be their downfall. Because of it, the soldiers had managed to close the distance between them. He knew he might regret this, but he had to break the order that was given to him. He began his trill of master over and over, eventually forcing the adults to stop their play. Cain calmly asked his opponent to hold on a minute. He disappeared from his place, only to reappear a moment later, right before Lito. The human saw the malicious intent barreling down on him and did his best to explain the situation. But nothing was going to stop the elven as he grabbed the little demon around the neck and forced him against the canyon's wall. Seeing as how his order was extremely clear, the kid was begging him to send him from this world. Through the vice grip, he forced out that they had company. He simply needed to look up to see what awaited them. He forced his eyes away from the daggers of death the human was throwing in his direction. Their pursuers had indeed managed to close the gap they had worked so hard to build. Like a set of puppets, he heard, "What should we do?" repeated at least twice. The one-armed assassin, fully aware of the situation, disappointedly called out to Cain. The two would have to postpone their battle for a later date. If he couldn't obtain victory with his own hands, he simply didn't want it. Not only was the assassin's capability to speak strange, but he knew no assassin that possessed the righteousness of knighthood. "Cain Ballstein, you have committed the same sin as me, and the only way for us to be forgiven by the Almighty God Albino is through death." With that, he disturbed the water and commanded the commander to stay alive. As he disappeared, his final words, that the two would meet again, were left drifting on the wind. Lito couldn't understand how his life had evolved to the point where he was hanging out with such monstrous bastards. The Crimson Commander was extremely pissed. He had lost the opportunity to face a worthy opponent, because some trash bastards decided to intervene. The Vogue tracker had finally managed to spot their target. Reluctantly, he handed his looking glass off to the prince. As old ways die hard, the prince attempted to use his once dominant eye to spy upon their target. Not a single man thought it was wise that the tracker believed it was his place to correct the prince. Now that he was using the right eye, he could confirm that it was indeed the slave that removed his eye. But the red armor individual who stood by his side posed them real trouble. What was Cain Ballstein doing here? The stiletto assassins should have handled him by now. Those simple fools running around worshipping their god, but they couldn't kill off a single target. His guard knight advised him not to push in on this one. They needed more manpower to secure their victory. How could he back out at a time like this? To do so would jeopardize his attempt at claiming the throne. Even in their current position, they had the superior numbers. With the 2 knights in his repertoire, he would be the one making the decision here. Prince Romer decided to take the chance of killing Cain himself. If he succeeded, no one would ever look down upon him. He ordered his men to descend. The guard knight knew this would be the hill the prince would attempt to die on. To his horror, the men were attempting to follow the orders of their liege. The foolish Volks were readying the grappling hook for immediate deployment. The 3 aimed the hook, sending it flying. As it crashed into the ground directly on target, they secured the rope. The night guard made sure, for the sake of his men, that he led the charge. Without wasting time, the group proceeded to rappel down the line. For this group to catch them so quickly only meant that other soldiers would also be close by. They would die if they took on an unknowable number of soldiers in a place like this. Cain ordered Fork to move. If they stood a chance of survival, they would have to make it into the forest. Lito couldn't believe, the world simply didn't want him to have a moment of peace. Assassin. Stiletto operatives. Volk's youth forged in shadows among the Volk's tribe's youthful ranks. A select few are chosen as candidates for a unique destiny, becoming stiletto assassins. These chosen youths are plucked from their roots by the enigmatic Bathory family, seamlessly integrated into a covert assassination unit known as Stiletto. Here, they undergo intensive training and relentless brainwashing, forging them into ruthless and efficient assassins. In their pursuit of absolute secrecy, an eerie transformation befalls these young operatives. Their vocal cords are surgically altered, robbing them of the power of speech. This drastic measure ensures that their lips remain forever sealed, only opening to heed the unspoken commands of the Bathory family. Source: Albania Continent Encyclopedia by Jana Elliott. West of the continent lay purple skies. There was a cursed land where all kinds of monsters appeared. The arena of tribal warfare was the battlefield. Somewhere there, a young warrior rested upon a rock, taking the moment to meditate before the next battle begins. A small, shaggy beast appeared, wondering if the day had come when the young warrior had finally perished. While he wasn't pleased to be disturbed, he insisted he was merely resting. Taking out the beast on the ground had been closer than it ever was before. He had even been injured, cracking a rib in the process. The little woolly man assured him he was better off than the creature down below. Better to have broken bones than ones that were turned to powdered dust. This was the 3rd winker, in as many days. The most peculiar thing was they had no idea where it came from, as they weren't able to find a single clue that would lead them to the spider nest where it was created. The whole time they were talking, the little beast was munching away on dried meat he had found upon the corpse of the winker, with no intent of sharing with his comrade. The young warrior demanded his cut. Even the little disgusting rat that produced it wasn't enough to stop him from eating. He didn't care what the woolly man believed. The little vermin was disgusting and he could care less about its feelings. Not only did he not have a good feeling about this, but now was a bad time for their leader to be away. The little man agreed that more chances than not, the young warrior's hunches were correct. But, regardless, they couldn't shuck their duties and run off to Cain Ballstein's rescue. They had too much to do on this front. But having the same fears, the little man had already done the best he could, by sending Cain the only reinforcement they could afford to lose. The warrior finished his meat and demanded more, foolishly forgetting about the little rat that would be its delivery man. The forest turned out to be everything they hoped for and needed. The pursuing force was instantly timid in its depths, weary of every shadow they passed. After watching the timid rats, Cain decided that he was wrong. This might be fun after all. 18 soldiers was a decent number, 20, seeing as Prince Romer and his knight Captain Khan decided to enter this temporary battleground. Cain chuckled at the thought that the prince was only a child. His eyes zoomed in on what he could only describe as a pleasant surprise. It seemed the prince had a few gems left up his sleeve. This behemoth of a knight was completely new to Cain. He looked like the kind of monster who would go to the end of the world to get his man. And judging by the Cerberus's reaction, he wasn't going to be a pleasant person to deal with. He was sure the cat was out of the bag. If it hadn't been before, it was now. Lito was in shock that Cain was preparing for battle. He couldn't believe he was seriously contemplating taking on 20 people at once. And as if to prove to the newbie how things were done, he stepped out into the open, wasting no time setting the tone for the battle ahead. How dare you put a hit out on me? Is my influence that detrimental to your future? His opening salvo wasn't enough. He fully intended to cut deep into this child. But I will say I'm impressed. I never would have thought that such a coward would show his face before me. Cain's last statement was a gut punch to the prince. Completely infuriated, Prince Romer offered up 1,000 silver to the man who brought him Cain's head. Such an amount was a mere pittance, if it brought him the death of Cain Ballstein. This was exactly what he wanted. The prince's anger had boiled over to the point where he sent his men off into battle using money as the main influence. There was no doubt mistakes would be made because of the tantalizing reward. Multiple soldiers rushed in, but Cain simply sidestepped the initial attack, putting himself in the best position to slide his blade into the back of the Voke. The others had no intention of wasting the life of their comrade, sending multiple arrows flying towards the preoccupied commander. The arrows dug into flesh halfway up the hilt. Cain was just too experienced for such a simple move to work on him. Luckily, their attack did what it could to put their fellow soldier out of his misery. The death stare they received because of their action was enough to put the entire group on edge. Even the giant behemoths' blood boiled at the declaration. Lito was struggling with an internal battle of his own. Going up against such a large number of enemies was insane. If his blueskin master died, he would be left in a perilous situation. His instincts screamed for him to retreat. But therein lay his dilemma. Because of the spider eggs, his only path forward was for the both of them to make it free of this entrapment. As he scanned the field for the best place for him to enter the battle, his eyes landed on his numero uno. Without further thought, he burst out of his hiding spot, gaining all the motivation he needed, intent on this being the day that he avenged his mother. Watching the interaction before him, Prince Romer began to sweat. He was starting to understand his guard's hesitation. Even being outnumbered 20-1, Cain's actions were simply putting them to shame. He wasn't a fool. If a drastic shift took place in this battle, he had already mapped out his plan of exit. His eye went wide as he picked up on the commotion to his right. The asshole who took his eye was barreling in his direction. The circumstances had changed. The night guard warned the prince that this was a situation that was better left in his hands. The winker wasn't something that the prince should waste his time attempting to put down. Prince Romer wasn't having any of it. His failure of a guard could shut up and go fight Cain. Without another word, he bounced away intent on putting the slave in his place. The trash only managed to take his eye because he was caught off guard. He wouldn't be outdone by a mere slave. After all, he was destined to become the king of all Elven. He would cut down this slave using his innate talent as a swordsman. The grand battle had concluded almost as swiftly as it had started. Lito effortlessly moved into the path of the king's strike, expertly piercing his second eye. The once formidable adversary crumbled, as though no more resilient than one of the famed cherries of Camp Castle. Though Lito couldn't help but feel disappointed at the ease of his triumph, he squared his shoulders and advanced toward his fallen foe with unwavering determination. The blind prince reacted to the crunch of the snow, swinging his sword wildly in a desperate attempt to ward off Lito, insisting that any further approach would lead to his demise. However, the threat rang hollow at best. "Is there pain? Does it sting?" Prince Romer found himself disoriented. This wasn't the outcome he had anticipated. Nevertheless, it paled in comparison to the agony he had endured. "Those delicate royal hands of yours stripped me of all I ever possessed." Lito contemplated putting an end to it all. The suffering the pampered crybaby endured seemed trivial compared to his own torment. The prince wept, sensing his demise drawing near. Out of the shadows emerged the fallen knight, who, despite his constant letdowns, would not allow anyone to claim the prince's life on this fateful day. The blow was so sudden that Lito had no recollections of exactly what hit him. All he knew was that everything had a red hue. The knight saw to his prince. The blow had left him completely blind, but the state was only temporary as his left eye was still in the process of recovering. If he hoped to salvage this new injury, he needed a doctor immediately. The knight gathered up his future king, and passed over authority of the battlefield to Sir Worcester. He wasn't taking any chances, he intended to get the prince back to Kem Castle to seek the treatment of a doctor immediately. Sir Worcester's expression was as deadpan as ever. As the two retreated from the battlefield, the prince couldn't help but toss ridiculous demands at the remaining soldiers. He wanted that slave returned to him alive. If they failed to accomplish this, their heads would roll. The no-nonsense knight disregarded the command immediately, sending 2 soldiers to kill the winker before he could lose control. The 2 rushed in, intent on putting Lito down fast and smooth. He could barely stand. The previous attack had rendered his body useless. A swift, ominous silhouette streaked across the battlefield, leaving only 1 soldier standing in the wake of its passage. The vigilant guards swiftly responded to the sudden appearance of the Cerberus, their firearms unleashing a barrage of arrows upon the menacing figure. Lito's sole focus was now on reaching the pup, as the thought of any harm befalling Samuel under his watch was something he could not bear to contemplate. Taking his eyes off his enemy was foolish, and it wasn't long before he paid for it with a shield smash to the body. This soldier wasn't taking any chances, immediately going in for the killing blow. He only just managed to get his fork into position as he struggled to stay alive. The Voke was simply doing the human a favor. He would end the human now, for if he managed to become a full monster, none of humanity would recognize him. The enemy's blade inched ever so slowly towards accomplishing this task. Within moments, it dug into his skin, sending blood running down his face. The pain triggered the human. His enemies should think twice before underestimating him. He forced his will onto the fork, instantly shattering the sword. The sight of the appendage rotating at immense speed stunned the soldier, giving Lito the opportunity to find the leverage he needed to plunge his arm into his enemy's throat. The word monster slipped from his dying lips. At this point, the former slave could care less. He pinned the soldier to the ground, deciding if that was what it took to survive, he would just become a monster. As the pleas of the Voke fell on deaf ears, he let his fork rip, causing a complete mess to be scattered across the battlefield. And the monster they all feared rose to the surface. The figure darted through the air with the agility of a Tasmanian devil, leaving onlookers astonished. As reinforcements arrived, their shock was twofold. Not only did they discover their comrade in a dire condition, but their collective dread was intensified by the enigmatic creature that sent shivers of pure fear coursing down their spines. Humans. Among the diverse array of intelligent beings inhabiting the Albanian continent, humans reigned supreme in terms of population. With a wide spectrum of hair and eye colors and predominantly fair, often yellowish or white skin tones, their physical diversity is a hallmark of their species. However, the history of humans on this continent is fraught with conflict. Prolonged hostilities have persisted between them and the elven and Voke kind, leading to protracted wars. Tragically, in the course of these conflicts, many human children have been taken captive, condemned to lives of servitude within the elven society. Source: Albania Continent Encyclopedia by Jana Elliott. The Volks were acutely aware that they had ventured into a perilous predicament. Confronting this monstrous foe left them feeling utterly outmatched. Cain moved gracefully across the battlefield, effortlessly dispatching soldiers as if it were a mere triviality. Their only certainty in the face of such a behemoth was the ever-present specter of death. What made the situation all the more terrifying, however, was the unsettling peals of manic laughter that followed Cain's ruthless killing spree. Early in the battle, Cain made sure the soldiers comprehended the formidable adversary they were pitted against. His swift defeat of 4 soldiers simultaneously left an indelible mark of dread on nearly every Voke on the field. Yet, even as fear coursed through the ranks, a few among them possessed the fortitude needed to rally their comrades. A resolute shield man implored his fellow Volks to stand their ground. Their sole objective, to persevere long enough for the main unit to arrive and reinforce them. Sir Worcester grew weary of observing the melancholy assembly of soldiers. Gripping his hammer firmly, he issued a command for them to clear his path. With the unwavering dignity befitting a knight, he approached Cain, the renowned knife knight, although no introduction was truly necessary. Nonetheless, he introduced himself as Worcester, a member of the illustrious Full Fork family, well versed in the intriguing tales that surrounded Cain. Cain found it captivating that his accomplishments were reduced to mere rumors. "You, Cain Ballstein, a distinguished member of the Elven Kingdom's most formidable organization, the 13 Knights Restaurant, currently holding the esteemed #1 position," Worcester declared. "Personally, I've always yearned to ascertain the veracity of these rumors. I hereby challenge you to a duel." Before the words had fully departed his lips, he lowered his colossal hammer, intending to bring it crashing down upon the renowned knife knight. Cain, seemingly anticipating such a treacherous maneuver, effortlessly sidestepped the attack. The behemoth braced for Cain's anticipated counterattack, but halfway through, he abruptly intercepted Cain with a powerful blow to the face, blinding him momentarily. With his target now in clear sight, the behemoth wielded his hammer, propelling Cain across the battlefield. This sudden turn of events provided the soldiers with their first glimmer of hope, suggesting that survival in this battle might indeed be possible. Cain lay sprawled on his back as the behemoth began to doubt the veracity of the rumors surrounding him, a regrettable realization. "If only I had been born a decade earlier and gone to war," mused the young Full Fork. "No doubt, I would have led the Red Army. Your accomplishments, even your position as the mightiest knight in the restaurant, would have been mine. But with the human elf war at an end, there's no longer a stage for me to claim the recognition I deserve. Nonetheless, I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to spread my reputation far and wide. I shall become the renowned knight Worcester Full Fork, the dashing young warrior who single-handedly vanquished the treacherous Cain. My name will echo through history, while yours fades into obscurity." Cain's maniacal laughter cut short the exuberant young knight's speech, his expression souring as he inquired about the source of the elder's amusement. Without hesitation, the Crimson Commander spat out what had once been a perfectly intact tooth, now replaced by a conspicuous gap in his once flawless smile. He sneered at the audacious words, his mirth undiminished. "You can't possibly believe a word of what you're saying, with that ugly face," Cain retorted incredulously, utterly astounded by the audacity of the but ugly youth. The behemoth wasted no time, charging forward with a singular intent, to end this encounter once and for all. As his strike descended, a sudden realization struck him like a bolt of lightning: Cain had vanished. In a swift and calculated move, the Crimson Commander reemerged, focusing on neutralizing the towering behemoth. With precision, he executed a nimble maneuver, severing the tendons behind the giant's knees, sending the colossal foe crashing to the ground. Sensing the moment, Cain moved swiftly, straddling the fallen giant's neck. Cain forcefully brought down his dual blades in an attempt to sever the young knight's head, only to have his attack thwarted by the sturdy shaft of Worcester's hammer. "What's amusing, you wonder?" the Crimson Commander began, his voice dripping with wisdom. "On the battlefield, I encountered beings beyond your wildest of imagination. It was a realm where beasts prepared for death, regardless of their race, they congregated. Amidst those battlefields, you'd find individuals far mightier than yourself. So, watching an inexperienced novice like you delve into a subject he can scarcely fathom, it's nearly impossible not to find it amusing." An eerie yellow radiance emanated from the ass backward armor, signifying dinner was close at hand. Cain's blade began to emit the same hue as his armor's eyes. Between the scorching heat and tremendous force, the behemoth's hammer shaft began to melt, a baffling sight. Ordinarily, no ordinary weapon could even scratch Titan steel. The giant found himself ensnared in a precarious stalemate, where any move he made risked the fiery blade slicing deep into his neck. Desperate, he ordered the soldiers to open fire on Cain, but the group hesitated, none willing to make the first move. "You requested a duel, did you not? Even if you were a king interfering in a knight's duel, it's an absolute taboo. You'd know this if you were a true knight." The young elf's tone shifted, now brimming with respect. He implored Sir Cain to hold off. "One of the reasons their race is so formidable is their remarkable regenerative ability. To permanently incapacitate one, you must inflict damage beyond their ability to regenerate. For example, if you were to remove both an elf's arms, it simply wouldn't be enough. Tears ran out of the eyes of the prideful knight, as Cain proved this point. As the arms dropped to the ground, he demonstrated the best way to deal with one of his kind. Decapitation was a surefire way to make sure you never heard another peep out of an elf. A tiny help slipped from the lips of the not-so-gentle giant, as Cain removed his head and turned off the lights for good. As he rose from the corpse, he made sure the soldiers understood that there were no nobles among them. If they valued their life, they would leave the battlefield immediately and never look back. The group didn't have to be told twice. If they fought, they would surely perish. Instead, they would inform the prince that the two managed to escape. The group collected their injured and made a slow but steady retreat. The Knife Knight Cain lived up to his reputation as a monster. They all knew they were lucky to leave with their lives. Chills ran down their spines simply thinking about how many more monsters like Cain roamed the western battlefield. As he watched, the group of soldiers vanished through the trees. He knew it wouldn't be easy for his armor to repair the damage. Kairon had grown significantly weaker and needed to be fed if he expected anything short of a miracle. Once he collected Fork, the two would continue their journey west. Cain called out for the human, but was rewarded with complete silence. Just as he figured the coward had made a run for it, he spotted a Voke with a hole in his chest. People who are bitten by the wink spider and become winkers fall into two categories. A demon who harnesses the power received from the spider, or a monster who is consumed by the power and loses their sanity. Cain stared down at the body as his thoughts began to lean toward the latter. The kid had great potential. It was a complete shame that it ended this way. He stared up at what remained of the young human hanging from a tree. You could practically sense the seething anger emanating from the fully transformed Winker. His loathing for the elven race was immeasurable. The creature had made its choice, gracefully leaping from tree to tree in search of the perfect angle. Cain effortlessly tracked the creature's every move as it circled around him, ultimately delivering a direct strike. The Winker had put everything into the attack, but it proved too much, forcing him back into his human form. For a fleeting moment, Lito's hatred paralyzed him in place, but he eventually let out a huff, realizing that a single blow revealed the truth. This supposed elven adversary was far from the formidable figure he'd imagined. With determination, Lito lunged forward to finish what the elf had started, making sure Cain knew that he could blame his luck for being born an elf. His astonishment knew no bounds when his most formidable foes simply ceased to exist. Lito found himself surrounded by impenetrable darkness, unable to sense anything. Suddenly, a colossal crimson hand flicked him in the center of his forehead, sending him crashing into what bizarrely resembled a dinner plate. No matter how hard he tried, no part of his body would respond. Two piercing yellow eyes appeared from the unyielding darkness. Lito stared straight on, intent on showing no weakness. But that was before the ass-backward armor appeared, giggling for no rhyme or reason. The armor retracted a blade from his hand, his intent evident in his eyes. The sight gave Lito the strength to move, as he screamed for the monster to stay away from him. Kairon slid his knife through Lito's arm as if it were nothing more than butter. Besides the pain, all he was aware of was laughter from all directions. The pain was simply unbearable. He felt as if he was being ripped apart at the source. Kairon wasted no time. His meal was still hot and waiting. As he put away his knife, he reached down and plucked up the delicious morsel. And with pure joy, he dropped it directly into his mouth. Lito watched on in a completely fragile state. As the world around him faded, all he could hear was laughter, and the sound of someone enjoying a very tasty meal. The armor gave his compliments to the chef. At no point in their journey had snow fallen from the sky as hard as it was this night. But regardless, the lone elven trudged along, followed by the beast and his boy. The trauma of the night had been too much. It was completely responsible for tethering Lito to his deep slumber. But every once in a while he would break free for a moment to glimpse the realities of the world. The soft thought, a realization that his arm had been removed, echoed through his head. As he faded back into oblivion, he found it strange that there was no pain. Only a ceaseless itching where his arm once was. Before his eyes completely faded from this reality, he realized he had failed. The crazy bastard was alive and well. He reaffirmed his commitment to erase the elven's presence from this world forever. The sound of what could definitely be mistaken for something other than music pulled him from his slumbers. This time, he wondered what was at play that kept him securely out of the world of reality. But he quickly dismissed the thought as a sight out of this world appeared before his eyes. The giant crab had to be a dream. But even in his dream, he knew a delicious sight when he saw one. He fell asleep, wishing he could devour every bit of it. Lito shot awake, his body extremely emaciated and covered in sweat. His eyes panned around his environment to a sight completely out of this world. Everywhere he looked there were sights he could hardly fathom, from hung birds to the skeletons of creatures he couldn't name. To tools he had no idea what they were for. And tanks filled to the brim with liquid, teeming with what he could only imagine was some kind of deadly parasite. But the oddities of the room couldn't keep his mind off the crazy bastard. At least until he laid his eyes on the most disgusting thing he had ever seen. He had had enough. He needed answers on why he had been left smack dab in Creepsville. While he was most definitely a noob. His instinct screamed that something was way closer than it should be. Lito shot across the room, disturbing odds and ends as he went. The blue-skinned witch doctor didn't care for the disturbance of her things. At first glance, based on her appearance, Lito made the decision that she was an enemy. To him, her skin color was all the justification he needed to attack. She took note of his quick decision-making. Before implanting an acupuncture needle directly into his neck. Her precision was impeccable. Lito tumbled to the ground. The inexperienced kid had made the wrong decision. He lay on the ground, furious that for the second time control of his body had been snatched away from him. With her target neutralized, the agile witch doctor imparted a bit of wisdom. In the future, he should assess the situation carefully before charging at his opponent. First, you check to see if there is any hostility. If so, then next find out how big the gap is between you and your opponent. It's always wise to gain as much insight into the other party. This is essentially the beginning of using your sixth sense. For example, she had discerned that he was a know-nothing novice. And she really had no idea why Cain had chosen such a basic human. His anger rose. This blueskin knew the crazy bastard. She tempered this anger by explaining she needed him to behave, for she was going to attempt to remove the spider hatchling inside of him. As she removed the pin, she prayed he understood that she was his only hope. Time passed slowly as the delicate work took place. The witch doctor indeed had the skill it took, and before long he was safely off the operating table. Upon exiting her home, he realized he had not been dreaming. The giant crab was real. He was overjoyed as Sandal came scampering over towards him. The pup was a resilient soul, seeming no worse for wear from his attack at the hands of the soldiers. The witch doctor praised herself, announcing that she had successfully completed the procedure. Cain was surprised and impressed. It seemed the young fellow had survived once again. He would need that luck as things were only going to get tougher from here. Cain had come through upholding his end of the bargain. With the spider removed, Lito would now serve as his shield from this moment to the day he died. He thanked his master. The fact that his life wasn't in immediate jeopardy hadn't fully sunk in yet. Now that that was done, the witch doctor had questions and she needed answers. She pulled the human's attention to the item in her hand. "This is the spider egg I found when I cut your stomach open. It was just about to hatch." Lito was starting to realize the position he was in. "Do you see the two horns on the top of its head? This is a distinct feature I have never come across in any other winged spider. So the spider that bit you, what did it look like? How big was it?" Lito admitted he hadn't managed to see it clearly. The spider seemed much bigger than him, at least twice his height. This was more than she ever hoped for. A female spider, as big as that, was simply unbelievable. She just had to lock down this discovery. She needed to know where. she had to go find it. Lito stumbled over the words Chem Castle. But Kane stepped in, explaining that it was a completely useless endeavor. The giant spider had already flown the coop when he arrived. The witch doctor gave him that side eye as she sucked her teeth. But he didn't come empty-handed. He could part with the knowledge he observed. He knew the moment he saw so many male spiders congregating that it wasn't a typical spider. This was the perfect explanation for Lito's extreme regenerative capability. The statement brought his attention to his right arm. And he immediately remembered, realizing that it wasn't a dream after all. The horror of being looked upon as nothing more than dinner. And the sounds the ass-backward armor made as he chewed on what he believed to be a tasty morsel. Lito was left with the trauma at the forefront of his mind. Kane had never witnessed a full arm regenerate in less than a day. And better than that, his armor had never had such a satisfying meal. Even now, it was attempting to cope with the amount of power that was forced into it from consuming the right arm. From now on, your right arm will be kept on standby as Quarren's emergency energy source. Lito never expected to be put in such a position. If he stuck around this crazy bastard, he had no idea when his death would come, but he was sure it would be sooner rather than later. He just had to escape those hungry eyes as soon as possible. Enigmatic creations, living armor. Living armor stands as one of the most mysterious and perplexing creations to emerge from the craft of witches. Despite my exhaustive research, the precise methods of its fabrication remain shrouded in secrecy, known only to the most skilled among witchkind. These exceptional practitioners harness the art of crafting living armor, a testament to their extraordinary abilities. What sets this armor apart is its remarkable ability to evolve in tandem with its wearer, unlocking incredible powers in the process. However, this symbiotic relationship comes with a unique requirement: sustenance. To sustain its unparalleled capabilities, living armor hungers for nourishment, and nothing seems to tantalize it more than the elusive winged spider. Source: Albania Continent Encyclopedia by Jaina Elliott. The demonic elf decided to make Lito's place as an emergency food source known by immediately proceeding to chop off 2 of his fingers, making the sad excuse that it was to test his regenerative capabilities, when really he just wanted to give that ass-backward armor its favorite new treat. Lito decided to up his ambition for revenge. When the opportunity presented itself, he would make sure he did it in the most agonizing way possible. But to his surprise, the fingers indeed grew back in less than an hour. But that's when the blue-skinned scoundrel decided it was wise to push the human's limits. If it wasn't for the witch's scientific reasoning that his regenerative abilities were exclusive to his right arm, the bastard would have had no problems feeding Lito's left hand to his greedy pet. She introduced herself as Korn, the mysterious witch that Lito would have only heard of in rumors. Their conversation continued deep into the night, turning towards a certain assassin who possessed living armor. The witch was puzzled by the news. Kane assured her there was no mistaking the armor for anything other than the real deal. For one to attain such an armor, the approval of the Grand Witches was a must. And she was sure those stuck-up witches wouldn't grant approval to a mere assassin. Lito's attention was piqued. This was the first he had ever heard of the words living and armor being used in tandem. The scientist in the witch jumped out. The young human had certainly heard the truth. Living armor was precisely what it sounded like, armor with a pulse. This extraordinary armor, when worn, melded seamlessly with the wearer's mind and body, creating a profound synergy between them. It adjusted itself to match the wearer's personality, showcasing a range of functions and steadily gaining strength alongside its companion. This remarkable creation was a once-in-a-lifetime achievement for a witch, an ultimate secret of unparalleled power. It was not to be underestimated. Lito was starting to like her, but this new development made it a bit hard. Kairon was her once-in-a-lifetime creation. And to think she believed he would be impressed to know that she was the creator of the item that was using him as a food source. Even though she was known for her academic prowess and her attention to detail, this time she wasn't going to be of any use to Kane. Sadly, she had been completely locked out of her information network. All thanks to her insatiable curiosity. Because of her own actions, she was expelled from the witches' council. Cain wasn't surprised that the other witches had come to realize her true lack of talent. Corn was thrown by Cain's absurd comment. She believed her skills to be at the peak of excellence, always in a state of evolution. She was removed from the council for sticking her nose where it didn't belong. It turned out the old stuck-up witches didn't appreciate the likes of her eavesdropping on the grand witches' gathering. But she didn't believe it was necessary for them to make such a big deal out of it. The pursuit of knowledge, and the satisfaction of curiosity, these traits were in essence what a witch was. Tears flowed from her eyes. Her curiosity had caused her to be sent into exile. For the next 5 years she was banned from having any contact with another witch. Even for a genius like her, this would be a major setback. Her babbling forced the words of the assassin to surface in Cain Ballstein's mind. His situation was extremely similar. Because of the excessive time he spent on the battlefield, he was now out of the loop. His instincts screamed that something detrimental to their world was in the process of unfolding. This detour had wasted enough of their time. The mystery of the assassin would eventually be solved. It was time for them to move on. Like the gentleman he was, he attempted to wish his favorite witch a farewell. There was no way she was going to allow him out of her sight until he answered a few key questions. Was he truly planning on taking out what was most likely the future king of their people? Regardless of his thoughts and feelings, Prince Romer was still the king's own flesh and blood. No matter how hopeless the child was, there was no way the king would sit back and allow harm to come to the boy. She had to know if her friend was willing to stand in the way of the king. All Cain knew was that he was going to retrieve his army from the battlefield, and then immediately proceed to take the head of his enemy. And anyone who dared to get in his way would also see the same fate. If that happened to be the king, then so be it. The young witch wasn't surprised. This was a typical Red Commander move. With his intentions now clear, it was time for him and the boy to move out. To his surprise, the young human refused. His first priority was to find his brother. While they had both been slaves at Kem Castle, his brother had been sent away to Siren Castle. The young human dropped to his knees. If he was allowed to find his brother, he would cease his attempts at escape. And henceforth he would allow his right arm to be used to whatever ends the elf saw fit. Cain didn't even give the proposal a second thought. Their path would not deviate, the two would be heading straight west. For a second there, the kid had hoped the two had made progress. He refused to be taken as some kind of a joke. He would be finding his brother before they did anything else. With the heat of his fury radiating through his body, he decided there was no better time to make a stance than right there. If this was the way it was, then so be it. Now that he wasn't bound by the threat of the spider hatchling, he would make true to his promise to kill the bastard. As Lito stared at the elf's back, Cain made sure he understood that if he took a single step forward, he would die. The malicious intent that the two harbored was so thick you could literally see it. Before an unnecessary battle could begin, Corn came to the human's rescue. The words masquerade ball exploded from her lips. In 2 days' time, the annual masquerade ball would take place at Siren Castle. She knew Cain too well. Before he headed off to battle, he never missed the event. Unlike Lito's proposal, this time, he put serious thought into the plan. This was pure foolishness. The witch's plan wasn't going to work. Why would the blue-skinned bastard have any interest in a dance? But to his astonishment, this guy was actually considering it. It was decided they would make a detour to Siren Castle, during which time the human could search for his brother. Lito thanked his master out loud, but inside he hated the effing bastard. What would a ball be without the appropriate attire? Since this was the witch's idea, she would be in charge of dressing the child. A malicious smile spread across her face. The human might not know it, but she was completely indebted to him. Because of this, she would pick him out the coolest outfit. Her attention turned to the little pup. Without a doubt, he too was going to need her expertise. The little Cerberus wasn't looking forward to whatever the foolhardy witch had planned. Being the fashionista that she was, it only took her a few moments to complete the ensemble. She got Kane's attention as she presented her work. Her fashion sense wasn't half bad, the human was indeed ready for society life. Now that he looked presentable, there was nothing stopping them from enjoying the ball. For Lito, this was not a pleasure trip. He wasn't interested in an excursion into elf society. Finding his only remaining family was his only priority. That night in the Siren area, northeast of Kem Castle, the atmosphere of the ball could be felt in the air. Even the poor and the decrepit knew the drill. The city was in full swing as the slave traders went about their daily business. This new batch of children were in great shape, so the coin flowed. There was no reason for them not to trade hands. But the human hunters didn't appreciate such a small token. With the scarcity of the humans, you would think that securing the valuable resource would be a lucrative endeavor. The trader Voke assured him that the whims of the aristocrats were out of his hands. It was their decree that to ensure the bloodline of the elven race that only children could serve as slaves. So their predicament wasn't his doing or his problem. But if they wanted to sell more of the little creatures, there was always a need. For in this castle, there was always a shortage of slaves. Being the businessman that he was, he assured the two that future merchandise would go for a higher price. The two hunters were skeptical, but what choice did they have? Under the bustling nighttime atmosphere, the hunters agreed to the proposal. That atmosphere carried to even the tallest towers, where aristocrats sipped wine by blazing hearths. The bitterness of the wine didn't bode well for the Count. It was the ill omen for the ball that would take place in only 2 days' time. Count Pillar pushed the thought away. Things always turned out for the best, even if they weren't quite ideal. He was pulled from his woes by an artisan who had arrived with the Venetian which had been carefully constructed to his exact wishes. It was magnificent. With it he would be the star of the ball and not that barbarian Kane. Witches, an intriguing offshoot of the elven race, have carved out their unique society within the depths of dense forests. Their existence is centered around the pursuit of knowledge, and their enigmatic abilities set them apart in numerous ways. One of their most peculiar talents involves the use of parasitic creatures known as red tapeworms, which enable them to reanimate the lifeless. In the annals of ancient history, a potent and mystifying force known as magic once held sway. As we persistently tread the path of knowledge, there remains the tantalizing possibility of encountering the elusive power of that ancient magic. Excerpt from the Writings of a Witch. Source: Albania Continent Encyclopedia by Jana Elliott. Not many aristocrats missed an opportunity to attend a top-level social event. So, when the elven high class started to file into his castle, Count Pillar, Lord of the North, knew his opportunity to shine was at hand. There was only one person in his life who he knew would interrupt him on such an occasion. Without having to turn around, he knew his sister, the Jewel of the North, was behind him. The beautiful, sophisticated, and kind Tyrell was the pinnacle of what all elven women strive to become. He was just about to go visit his lovely flower of a sister. But all the activity in the castle caused her to rush to her brother's side. She just couldn't believe the number of aristocrats who had chosen to attend their ball. The Count wasn't shocked in the least, it merely highlighted the extent of his influential growth. His sister had always been more than meets the eye, so he waited for her to present her true feelings on the matter. She detested the fact that the aristocrats were so willing to attend the festival when there was so much suffering because of the war. As she leaned out the window to view their guests, the Count's attention was drawn to the dirt upon her gown. He had long stopped trying to avert her attention from what excited her beyond the castle walls. He merely asked her if she was going to make such a trip, to make sure she at least shared a bit of food with the poor while she was out. Her amazing brother never failed to put a smile upon her face. But regardless of how she tried to distract herself, her mind always came back to how big a contradiction this world was. While the rich and influential indulged in such luxuries, the people outside the castle wasted away in squalor. Whether it was blue, green, or even yellow, they all needed to cast aside their superficial masks. How would the world change if no one was willing to put in the effort to understand each other? The Count really wished such heavy questions wouldn't rest themselves upon his sister's shoulders. And just as quickly as she started, she changed the subject. The only thing that brought her interest in these balls was Cain Ballstein. He informed her that this year she may be in luck as he heard rumors that Cain had recently been sighted near Camp Castle. While he resented it, he knew this was exactly what she needed to hear. Her face lit up with excitement, but time was short. They didn't have long till the start of the festivities, and she expected to find the perfect dress for the ball. He couldn't help but grin as his beautiful gem of a sister rushed away intent on being presentable for that low-life, Cain Ballstein. Not paying attention to where she was headed, she slammed headlong into a servant of the castle. The little fellow was sent tumbling across the floor. Before he could fully come to a stop, he was begging her for forgiveness. And just like that, all our hopes for the female side of the elven race were tossed out the window. The disgust and hatred on her face spoke volumes. The fact that she was prepared to do damage without dirtying her hand was simply absurd. The little fellow knew exactly what was coming the moment the glove came out. She began to beat him mercifully, sprouting on about how she could tolerate anything in this world, other than his ugly face. It was the one thing she would never forgive. She beat him until his blood began to flow. The whole time she was belittling his looks, he was begging for her forgiveness. The Count was simply not capable of watching his sister when she got in this state. In the end, all of this was the little freak's fault. If he had done like she said and wore a mask, her gown wouldn't now be ruined with his blood. And as fast as the disgusting mood came over her, it was gone. She decided a shopping trip to buy a new dress could easily fix this situation and put her day back on track. Aristocrats began the process of mixing and mingling on the dance floor. As the Vogue bards set the mood, the ballroom rolled into a full swing. The Venetians added just the right layer of mystique, allowing the aristocrats to leave their day-to-day personas behind. To the Vogue servant, this scene was beyond old and completely stale. At this point, he didn't care what they would do to him. He should be at home in his bed, but these elven felt that the middle of the morning was the perfect time for their soiree. The Count remained in the shadows. The excitement of his reveal was only moments away. When it was all said and done, he would rise above anyone in attendance. Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest sons and daughters of the god Albino, the pillars and foundation of our great elven kingdom. The Count had pulled the attention of all in attendance. Please, may this be a night that will always be remembered. The room was left speechless. Count Pillar had indeed risen above those in attendance. He sashayed around the room, complimenting his guests on their amazing costumes. But everyone there knew that he was the star of this show. The guests knew there had to be a deeper meaning to his masterpiece. And there was no way he was going to be allowed not to share it with the room. All his life he strived for this very moment. This room belonged to him. Cain could do as he wished. This time he would remain the main character. He cleared his throat as he began to explain the mystery of his mask. The various patches were made by stitching together the skins from various species, not excluding the very rare ones. And the blue jewels were the pride and joy of the piece. They represented the elven race as a whole. The attendees were impressed. Now that it was in the open, it made perfect sense. There was one guest who could care less what the Count was up to. His sister's attention was fully on the arrival of one man, and one man alone. The guards stood at attention. They had a sworn oath to protect the aristocrats with their lives. But they knew the sentiment wouldn't be returned. The young Vogue hoped that the aristocrats would at least leave them a few scraps, but in reality, their dinner would be nothing more than barley porridge. Right as they were settling in for a quiet night, a figure appeared before them. It was obvious that the disgusting individual didn't belong here. They didn't have food to give him, so he might as well turn around and head in the opposite direction. The two didn't know what hit them. They were down before they had the opportunity to recognize the danger before them. Cain dropped his disguise, cleaning away the blood. Lito had unto the end of the ball to retrieve his brother. If he wanted to stay in Cain's good graces, he would be in front of him the moment the ball ended. As he hurried off, not willing to waste a moment of time, Cain called after the human to let him know, if he tried to escape his clutches, his death would soon follow. He watched the two's retreating form, before turning towards his objective. The blueskins usually kept the human slaves tucked away deep below ground. So, he headed downwards to begin his search. This was the very opportunity he had been pursuing since the moment he escaped. His brother just had to be alive. Tyrell devoted her time to the relentless pursuit of her beloved, though with each fleeting moment, her optimism waned, and the harsh reality began to take root. Every man present observed her every step, yet her gaze remained solely fixed upon Cain. If he managed to arrive in time for the dance, he could still rescue the knight, and all would be right. More than anything, she yearned for that sensation, just as she did in days gone by. It was the sole source of vitality in her life. The Count was in his glory, the attention of the ball was where it should be. But it didn't remain there as an unknown source snatched his adoring fans away. The moment it happened, he knew what was going down. There was only one man who could pull a crowd like this. Cain Ballstein had just arrived at the ball. He made his way onto the dance floor with all eyes right where they belong. No one even attempted to conceal their murmuring as the rumors and speculations were voiced aloud. The siblings were left in complete shock, but for two very different reasons. The Count instantly went on the offensive. This was his ballroom, not a battlefield. No matter who Cain was, he had to adhere to proper etiquette. And his armor just wouldn't do. Cain simply smiled before proceeding to rip Charon from his chest. Right before the eyes of all in attendance, the armor yielded to his efforts. Not many in the room were disappointed as he placed the red armor upon his face. He put on quite the show, standing in his full glory before the crowd. But Charon didn't leave his master in such a state, sending out black gossamer to coat his body. Cain fought through the process, making ever-progressive steps towards his beloved. It had been so long since they last laid eyes upon each other. As the process was completed, he dropped to a knee, extending a hand to ask his lady to the dance. Elsewhere, Lito had made it deep beneath the surface of the castle. He enlisted Sambil's help as 4 eyes would be better than 2. He refused to give up. This place might resemble a maze, but if he kept looking, there was a chance he would stumble upon his brother. Avon had to be here. He might be blind, but he was the most useful person Lito knew. Surely the blue-skinned elves of this castle didn't dispose of him before recognizing his true potential. He knew in his gut that his brother was still alive. That was before he came to a sudden stop. The sight inside the cell was one straight out of a horror movie. He fell back before emptying the contents of his stomach. Every human in the cell's skin had been peeled away. With everything he had, he prayed that this wasn't the fate of his brother. A very familiar individual inquired if he thought the sight was a neat one. He had no doubt that he was the only person in existence who could peel skin as neatly as that. But the best part was, if the job was done well, that skin could be used to make masks. And the younger the human, the softer the skin. He wondered if the young human skin was as supple as his age would suggest. He set his giant monster loose. Boo knew the routine. If he managed not to destroy the skin, all of the meat would belong to him. The Cyclops began to drool at the thought of the tasty meal. All throughout the dance floor, Cain noticed an unusual bunch. Where there wasn't an aristocrat dancing, there was a solo individual standing. In his mind, there was no doubt where their interest lay. But to the aristocratic eye, this was just a more successful year than usual. Tyrell really hoped his return meant the war was finally over. Cain assured her that wasn't the case. There were still bands of humans that needed to be dealt with. Her hopes rose. Was it possible that she was the reason for his return? His typical smile spread across his face, having no problems explaining his intentions to kill Prince Romero. She laughed, assuming it to be a joke. But he reassured her he was not joking. He would cut down anyone who stood in his way. She assured him she had long since chosen sides. He would always find her in his corner. Her brother was furious. He accidentally assaulted the hand of his companion. Since he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to her, she was done with him. She would just seek out another gentleman to be her partner. The statement very much rubbed him the wrong way. Like he didn't notice her attention was fully on Cain. It was always Cain, Cain, Cain. The ball was very much a success, he could feel everyone was enjoying themselves. But without a doubt, everyone's attention was on Cain, as if he was the star of the stage. His spotlight was shining down on the pompous war hero. Regardless of his sister's feelings, he couldn't bring himself to forgive or forget. As the ethereal melodies of the music slowly faded into the background, an overwhelming surge of emotions coursed through the air, growing more profound with each passing moment. Every fiber of her being was wholly attuned to Cain, their presence intertwining like a tempestuous dance. In this fleeting instant, the culmination of their union approached at lightning speed. The world beyond them seemed to dissolve into non-existence, as if time itself had abandoned its purpose. This sensation echoed a distant memory, a feeling untethered from the constraints of time and space. Within this shared universe, she and Cain were the sole celestial bodies, their gravitational pull drawing every gaze on the dance floor. The sheer magnificence and splendor of their connection proved overwhelming for the onlookers, leaving the aristocrats in the audience bursting into spontaneous applause. Yet, amidst the thunderous applause and the enraptured crowd, the only gaze that truly mattered was the deep, unyielding connection in their eyes. She yearned to bridge the cosmic distance that separated them, much like a breathtaking star drifting endlessly through the vast expanse of space. Her moment of enchantment was violently shattered by a thunderous call of her beloved's name. In an instant, the entire ballroom was jolted from its reverie, every gaze fixing upon the armored and armed soldiers who had barged in, their steely resolve suggesting readiness for battle. The aristocrats gasped in shock, appalled that these intruders had dared to desecrate their sacred space with weapons in hand. But it was Count Pillar who swiftly silenced the murmurs of indignation that rippled through the crowd, his authority commanding everyone's attention. With a grave tone, he announced that the ball was abruptly concluded, and all must focus on the unfolding moment. The previous day had seen the arrival of a royal decree from the kingdom, bearing the solemn weight of the knight's oath, a sacred vow to protect the kingdom and its sovereign, an act tantamount to betrayal and sacrilege against the divine albinos should it be broken. The name that fell from the parchment like a poisoned dagger was none other than Cain Ballstein. He stood accused of the heinous crime of regicide, sending shockwaves of disbelief through Tyrell. She turned to her brother, her voice caught in her throat, incredulous that he could have played any part in insinuating Cain's involvement in such a nefarious plot to murder the king. This sent shockwaves through the aristocratic body. There was no way the king was dead. A few among them intended to travel to the capital themselves to prove these claims. Count Pillar made sure they all understood the seriousness of this decree. The king was dead. If they took into account that among the knights currently on the battlefield only Cain Ballstein had returned to the kingdom, what other proof did they need that he was the murderer? How strange was it that he chose to come back to society when the king was murdered? It was all starting to fall into place. The reason he was called back from the battlefield was for them to murder the king and put the blame on him. From the way this group was going on, there was a high chance that the king was indeed dead. But it just didn't make sense. Why was Romer going through such lengths for a throne that he would eventually inherit? A smile spread across his lips, because this was all just a bit too sloppy. What was the chance that the aristocrats in the room would buy it? He was the sole elven who stood at the pinnacle of affirming their race's superiority, above all others. The murmuring spread through the crowd. No one believed the war hero was capable of such dirty deeds. Exactly what would he stand to gain? Count Pillar was ready for this. Obviously, there had to be a reason. And he was going to reveal the secret of Cain Ballstein. The research of the great witches confirmed that Cain was born mixed with human blood. He was nothing more than a human impersonating a great elven. Of all the things the fool could have said, this took him completely for a loop. Count Pillar would not sit by and allow the name of Cain to continue to run through his psyche. It was finally time for his humiliation to come to an end. Today he had set the stage for his enemy's demise. And in the end, he would be the character who ruled the stage. He shouted for the attack to commence. As soon as the words "kill him" left his lips, the assassins hiding in plain sight removed their disguises and commenced their attack. This was no surprise to Cain. He had expected it all along. He was only a little upset that he would have to wait to ask about the nonsense that sprouted from Count Pillar's mouth. But in the meantime, he hoped this distraction would prove to be enjoyable. The castle's underground shook as the giant Cyclops went about his business. The creature was an expert at destroying his enemy without ruining its pelt. But Lito was proving to be more than they bargained for, as he continuously dodged the blows of the giant. But sadly for the kid, the creature was a quick learner and extremely fast on its feet. Lito had been led into the blow that sent him flying, crashing hard into the wall. He tumbled to the ground before the beast. But it seemed being a winker had its advantages, as he was able to leave a gash that would surely throw the Cyclops off its game. The giant's master was initially surprised when Lito's arm transformed. After all, it wasn't a secret that winkers are as strong as the most terrifying monsters. But luckily it seemed the young fellow hadn't made it to his full transformation yet. As a part winker, he stood no chance against the Cyclops. Even with the help of the dog, Lito was simply not a match for his beast. Cyclopses are dangerous creatures that the elven race used on the front lines to destroy the fortifications of the human race. This particular one had been tamed as a baby. Because of this, he didn't look down upon his master, only caring for the man that was on the inside. In this world, everyone was so obsessed with one's appearance. The little scalper was just about to make his point when he realized the human simply wasn't listening. That monster is incredibly fast for its size and has tremendous strength. And the worst part was that his fork couldn't pierce its skin easily. He only had one option, and he wasn't sure how to obtain it. The only way he could become stronger was if he managed to fully transform. The moment the thought ran through his head, he was transported back to the witch's crabbed shack. She made it perfectly clear that he shouldn't rely too much on the spider's power. His transformation into a complete winker could have been catastrophic for him. If Cain hadn't been there to force him to revert back to normal, there was a good chance he wouldn't be the human that was sitting before her. She needed him to realize, if he attempted it again, he would turn into a full-fledged monster and never return to them. With that option tossed out the window, what choices did he have left? He calmed down, remembering the lessons forced into his brain by the witch. First, he had to use everything around him. Simple landforms and terrain could be the difference between life and death. Next, he needed to consider his enemy's characteristics. If he made the right choices, Lito was sure there was a way out of this. And it wasn't like he was alone. Samdal was by his side. If Cain hadn't made it perfectly clear how useful Cerberus could be, then the witch's words left no room for him to misunderstand. The little fellow was extremely talented, and it was of the utmost importance that he put all his effort into training it well. Cerberus, an exceptional rarity on the Albanian continent within the rich tapestry of animal life that graces the landscape of Albania's continent, Cerberus stands as an exceedingly rare and enigmatic creature. Each individual of this species possesses a unique set of abilities, setting them apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. Additionally, Cerberus exhibits several intriguing features that further distinguish them. These creatures are known to be social beings, forming tight-knit herds or small groups despite their notable absence of reproductive organs. Such behavior underscores their evolutionary adaptation for survival at all costs, making them a remarkable and mysterious presence in the natural world. Source: Albania Continent Encyclopedia by Jana Elliott. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to support the original creators. Supporting their work will allow us to continue to get amazing chapters in the series. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.